Wonderful. Thank you all for joining me. My name, is Kalia Livingston, and I am the Fair Housing Project Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, also known as CVOEO. I really appreciate you all taking the time to take this workshop. Here with me is my colleague, Errol, and I'll let Errol introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Harold, and I work with CVOEO here in Burlington as a housing education specialist.
Great, thank you, Errol. And we also have Tracy Kraft here, who is a staff member of the local library in Springfield, who we have been collaborating together to put this event on. And Tracy will be helping with some tech administration and working on the back end of things.
I'd just like to thank you guys for signing up for this presentation. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. And I just see that another person joined us. So I just want to mention again that this workshop will be recorded. So it would be great if you could save all your questions for the end once the recording has stopped. There should be ample amount of time for questions at the end of the presentation. That being said, let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll ask you if you can actually see what's going on. So just give me 1 second.
I can see.
All right. Do you see the presentation?
I do.
Yes.
Great. And feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and Tracy can keep track of those, and we can also answer those at the end of the presentation. All right. So once again, my name is Kalia, and I'm the Fair Housing Project Education and Outreach Coordinator at CVOEO. I've been in my role for a couple of months now, so this is one of my first workshop that I'll be presenting by myself. So I'm really happy to have everyone here joining us and learning more about fair housing. Some of the things that we'll be discussing during this workshop are ways for identifying illegal housing discrimination, discussing the protected classes of people under fair housing laws. We'll briefly discuss some of the rights and responsibilities of tenants based on Vermont tenant laws. That'll include a little bit about security deposits, repairs, and what's necessary when moving out. And I'll also share some helpful resources that we have for folks to hold on to in case they have any questions that come up and need help navigating any housing situations. This is some information about our statewide Vermont Tenants Hotline. This is one of the most important pieces of information that you can take out of the workshop because we are always available to answer your questions that come up regarding rental housing. If you need a translator for a call or to discuss a situation, you can give us a call, leave a voicemail, and just mention the primary language that you speak, and we'll schedule some time with an interpreter to make sure we can answer your questions. So why is renting in Vermont so hard? As many people may know, we are currently facing a housing crisis statewide as well as nationwide. And unfortunately, that means that we have a very low vacancy rate, which the vacancy rate is out of 100 apartments, how many are open and available to be rented at a given time. A healthy number for a vacancy rate is between 3 to 5%. So up here in Chittenden County, it's 1% right now. So it's really, really hard to find housing in Chittenden County. However, in doing a little bit of research regarding Windsor County, you all are in that healthy frame of the 3 to 5% at a 6.3% vacancy rate. So I am curious to know if that number reflects people's experiences when looking for housing and what factors play into the barriers or perceived limitations in folks finding housing. And that's something that we can discuss once I'm done presenting and we stop the recording. All right. So what is fair housing? Fair housing is tenants or any residents of any dwelling having the right to equal opportunity in housing choice, the right to rent, buy, finance, or live in a dwelling free from harassment or discrimination. So it's important that fair housing exists because it plays a huge impact on people's ability to access and maintain housing. As we all know, having housing is a huge part of someone's livelihood and well-being. It affects someone's ease to getting to work or school, their healthcare appointments, and just general recreation. So having affordable access to housing is important for a community because it helps with diversity and community building, as well as helps with the economy and the ability for businesses to open up in a given space. All right, so a little bit about the Fair Housing Act. It was enacted in 1968 to help remedy historical harms of segregation and systemic oppression that hindered African Americans from having access to safe and stable housing. As of now, there are now 7 federal protected classes, but states can also elect additional protected classes to work under their state fair housing laws. So this slide discusses which classes are protected federally. It includes race, skin color, national origin, disability, religion, family status, and sex. And then the Vermont fair housing protections are receipt of public assistance, gender or identity, sexual orientation, marital status, so whether someone is married or not, their age, and it also protects survivors of abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. Oops, excuse me, sorry. In Vermont, we also have a law that was passed against NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard, which prevents decisions regarding land use from not making affordable housing in certain locations based on people's dislike for changes in their communities. Ooh, okay, I'm sorry, my mouse is being a little funky today. Gotta go back. All right. So a big part of fair housing is protections for folks with disabilities. Most of the fair housing complaints that are filed in Vermont are due to illegal housing discrimination towards someone with a disability. That's in Vermont as well as nationwide. Following that is familial status and then discrimination against people based on their race or skin color. But something that someone can do to prevent housing discrimination is request a reasonable modification. A reasonable modification is requesting a physical change to a space in order to accommodate to someone's impairments or disability. So that could look like somebody needing a chairlift installed into their apartment or a grab bar installed in the shower. They could request this reasonable modification to modify the unit in order to help it be more accessible to them. Regarding what is reasonable is very subjective, so that can be challenging to determine. However, asking for a chairlift might be considered reasonable opposed to asking for an elevator to be installed in a unit. So reasonable is based on the time and money commitment to making the change, and that's something that can be discussed with a housing provider. And regarding who pays for these modifications, if somebody lives in housing that is government funded, that housing provider is generally responsible for paying for the modification. If someone has a privately owned housing provider, then that tenant might be responsible for paying for the chairlift or grab bar or a parking sign or something like that. So a reasonable accommodation is similar to a modification, but it's a change to a rule, policy, or practice. So that would be something like if your lease says no pets, but a person has an assistance animal. Assistance animals are not considered pets, so they could submit a reasonable accommodation asking that their animal be able to live with them due to the necessity in helping them make the place more accessible or helping with impairments that they have. Another example would be requesting a designated parking spot that's closer to the entrance to someone's home. Disability, what's considered a disability is on a very broad basis, and the definition is based on if they have receipt of SSI or SSDI, if they are perceived by others or known by others to have a disability, as well as people who are in recovery from a drug addiction. So if someone has a criminal background due to activity from supporting that addiction, they could request a reasonable accommodation that their criminal background doesn't impact their application due to it being a criminal background that they developed from activity in supporting their addiction. Disability also includes mental, physical, and emotional. All right, so these are a couple examples of what illegal housing discrimination can look like. So a housing provider refusing to rent to you, making housing unavailable to a specific class of people, or setting different terms, or giving differential treatment to different classes of people. So allowing a neighborhood of people or one apartment building of people and allowing a family of one race to cook certain meals, and then telling a family that's from a different country that they're not allowed to cook the cuisine of their culture. Or something like allowing adults to be noisy at night, but making a specific rule that children cannot be noisy past 10 p.m. That would be an act of illegal housing discrimination. And advertisements for spaces are also included in fair housing protection. So advertisements should be free of differential language or something like saying that a unit is best for single young professionals or something of that sort. I did want to mention there are also some exemptions to fair housing laws. That includes when the space is owner occupied, so in like a duplex or a triplex. Religious housing is also exempt, so a church or a religious group can have housing for folks who are members of that specific religion. And senior housing is also an exemption. So there are age restrictions generally on senior housing, so that wouldn't be illegally discriminating towards people who don't fit within that age bracket. Another exemption would be anything that goes against fire safety department codes. So having multiple people living in a studio. I believe the law is there can only be 2 people per bedroom. So it wouldn't be illegal housing discrimination to turn away a family of 6 for a studio apartment because that could be going against some fire safety code rules. All right, and these are some resources for if someone does experience illegal housing discrimination. You can always reach out to the Fair Housing Project here at CVOEO, and the number is stated above, or our hotline. If you call our hotline and it sounds like you're having a fair housing issue, Madeline, who does our hotline, will refer you to myself or my supervisor, Jess Hyman, and we can talk you through that situation. It's also important to document everything. So if you do end up moving forward with filing a complaint, which I'll get to what that looks like, you have journaled examples of the incidents of discrimination that you've experienced. And you can also file a complaint with the Vermont Human Rights Commission, as well as the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So those are 2 great resources to file fair housing complaints and hopefully come to a resolution or settlement based on the experiences that have taken place. So we're going to get a little bit into tenants' rights and responsibilities, and these are based on Vermont landlord tenant laws. So just the basics, a lease is a contract, so it's important that both the tenant and the housing provider uphold the stipulations of the lease and both have rights and responsibilities based on the terms of that lease. Once you pay the rent, you become the tenant of that space and must start upholding the terms of that lease as soon as you sign the lease. So it's important that you read the lease very carefully, and that's also something we could assist with if you reach out to our hotline and need some support in reading a lease. So it's important that you get a lease in writing, although verbal agreements or verbal contracts are legal in Vermont. Written leases just help really make things clear about what's expected when renting the space. All right. So one of the rights that tenants have is to have a refundable security deposit. Security deposits are generally intended to be somewhat of an insurance policy for landlords to keep to cover damages or expenses that might be left over from a tenant. If you don't damage the apartment and you keep the place clean and leave it clean upon moving out, it's likely that you should receive your deposit back. However, issues do come up. After you let your landlord know that you've moved out, the landlord has 14 days to return a security deposit or give a list of itemized costs that will be deducted from the security deposit. We recommend that on day 15, if you have not received your security deposit or that list of itemized costs, then you go straight to small claims court, or if you're here in Burlington, you could go to the Housing Board of Review to request a hearing, and they handle issues like security deposits. When you move in, we also recommend that you take lots of pictures of this place before you move your stuff into it and just document the conditions of the unit. And then upon moving out, do the same thing. So then you have something to compare to in case there is some issues that come up regarding you being charged for deposits or, you charge for damages that you may have not done. All right. Tenants also have a right to privacy, so your landlord shouldn't be coming into the space whenever they please. As soon as you sign your lease and take possession of that apartment, it becomes your home. So the landlord by law has to give the tenant at least 48 hours before entering the unit. If the landlord If the tenant agrees, the landlord can come in at any time or less than 48 hours, but they must give that 48 hours of notice prior to wanting to come into the space unless there's an emergency. Um, and there are 4 reasons why landlords should be entering your space. And that is when it's necessary to inspect the unit. It's necessary to make agreed upon repairs or alterations. They're supplying some kind of service, or they're showing the dwelling unit to prospective tenants or buyers of the building or contractors and things like that. It's just a little more information about proper notice for landlords coming into the space. And like I mentioned before, they can come in during emergencies like a fire or a flood. The notifications can take place by phone, in person, text, or a hand-delivered written letter. They just have to notify the tenant 48 hours prior to coming into the space. Right. And another right and responsibility of a tenant, tenants have a right to safe and decent housing, but they also have the responsibility to report needed repairs. So if there's any damages in the apartment that take place, it's important that you report those damages to be repaired to your housing provider as soon as you can, and definitely recommend reporting repairs that need to be made prior to moving out so they're not deducted from your security deposit. I'll mention a little bit about repair and deduct in the next slide, but there are some protections by law. Oh, sorry, keeps happening. To help tenants get the repairs that they need in a timely fashion. So tenants do have a right to repair and deduct, and that looks like requesting that a repair needs to be made in writing, giving the housing provider 30 days to make the repair. If they don't, and the repair costs less than half the amount of your of your rent, and the repair doesn't require like a licensed clinician to make the repair, then a person can do that repair themselves and then deduct the amount from their rent. We do recommend that you reach out to the hotline prior to doing any repair and deduct, and just making sure that you covered all of your bases and followed the preceding steps before doing that. Because most evictions that take place in Vermont have to do with not paying rent. So you want to be really cautious and certain about wanting to deduct anything from your rent before you do it. And tenants also have the right to live in a safe unit. So if any major code violations like the ones named on the slide come up, a tenant can reach out to their municipal code enforcement office, if there is one, and request an inspection. If your specific town does not have a municipal code enforcement office, then you can file a complaint with the the Division of Fire Safety, and request an inspection that way. And they can come in and check the apartment for any repairs and let your landlord know what needs to be repaired in order to bring the apartment up to code. It is important that they're notified in writing, so you can call and make a complaint, but there's also a process to do it in writing as well. That's something that we could assist with also if you call our hotline or reach out to the Fair Housing Project. Okay. If you do need to report a repair or a major code violation or request an inspection, tenants are free from retaliation. So if a tenant requested an inspection and then a week later they receive a termination of tenancy notice, any judge would consider that retaliation. Your landlord doesn't have the right to evict you. They can terminate your tenancy, but in order to evict you or shut off any utilities or remove your possessions, they have to go through the proper legal process to actually evict a person. So that would require going to court. This protection lasts about 90 days. So if you request an inspection, you're protected from any attempts to be evicted for up to 90 days. This is a little bit about notice periods. So tenants have a right to proper notice as well as to give proper notice. So if you're in a lease and your landlord sends you a termination of tenancy notice for no cause, they should give you at least 30 days or more to move out of the space. That doesn't mean that you have to leave the unit. Like I said, the landlord cannot evict a person, but if you continue to pay your rent and live in the space as you normally would, and the landlord would have to go through that legal eviction process to actually evict you from the space. So it's up to you to move out on that date that you receive a termination of tenancy notice. And landlords can also need to give you proper notice before increasing their rent. So that looks like 60 days after the most recent rental period. So the landlord can't just say, hey, I'm going to increase the rent next month and this is what it is. They have to give you at least 2 full rental periods. Generally, people pay on the first. So the rental period looks like from the first to the last day of the month. So that would be 1 rental period. So you need 2 of those before the rent increase can be enacted. And you also have the right to give proper notice. So before moving out, even if your lease is expired, you have to give at least 1 full rental period to your landlord and let them know that you will be moving out. I believe in Burlington, it's 2 full rental periods. However, I will discuss resources that we have, and one of those is the Definitive Guide to Renting in Vermont, which has very detailed information about how to navigate all sorts of different rental situations that come up. And it talks about the different notice periods that tenants and housing providers have to give for different aspects of renting, including moving in, moving out, ending tenancy, and rent increases, and so on and so forth. All right, so one of the main responsibilities that renters have is to pay rent on time. Like I said, 70% of evictions that take place in Vermont are due to non-payment of rent. We do have no-cause evictions in Vermont, which is unfortunate. So housing providers don't have to give you a reason for why they're asking you to move out of a space. But generally, people get evicted in our state due to not being able to pay rent. If that situation comes up, it's important that you reach out to the landlord and let them know about when they might be able to expect rent and a little bit about your situation. And you can also reach out to our office. We have 3 different offices here at CVOEO, and each of them have a community action program. So you might be able to get some financial support through one of our community action programs to help with paying rent and or back rent or a security deposit if needed. All right, and a little bit more information about resources that we have. We have our Vermont Tenants hotline, which I definitely recommend that folks jot down the number. I'll also put it in the chat later, along with some contact information. We have our definitive guide to renting in Vermont, as well as an illustrated guide to renters' rights, which is the illustrated version of the definitive guide. And all of our materials are translated and can be found online. Let's see. Some of our statewide renters resources include our renters workshops, which we have three of. One is tenant skills, which discusses more of the tenant's rights and responsibilities under Vermont tenant laws. You can also earn a certificate by taking that course. We also have our finding housing workshop, which gives tips on navigating our really tight housing market based on barriers that you might have or limitations that come up. And then we have our sustaining the renters workshops, which talks more about budgeting tips and how to finance and make sure that you're able to continuously maintain your rent and bill payments. If someone takes all three of our renters workshops, they can then schedule a financial coaching session and earn a preferred renter certificate. And with any of the renter certificates that you receive, you can apply those to your rental applications to let housing providers know that you are taking the steps to be a diligent tenant and you know what your rights and responsibilities are, and you are working towards having the most successful renting experience that you can have. And they can be really beneficial for people who don't have the best rental references or don't have any rental references. All of our online workshops are available through a self-paced platform online, as well as live via Zoom, which we teach each of them once every month. We will be newly teaching the Sustaining the Rent workshop on Zoom, and that will start in January. So if anybody is interested, I can also put that information in the chat for people to be able to sign up on Zoom or do the self-paced versions online. And we also have the workshops all translated in multiple languages for folks to listen that way and earn their certificates. And for fair housing resources, here's a number for Vermont Legal Aid. I'm not an attorney, so I can't give legal advice, but I can inform you of what your rights are. Vermont Legal Aid, if legal advice is needed or a person needs to engage in any sort of legal affairs based on a fair housing issue, we recommend reaching out to Vermont Legal Aid. You can reach out to us for a consultation or a referral, and we can help you file a complaint with like I mentioned earlier, the Vermont Human Rights Commission or the Department of Housing or Urban Development. And once again, here is our Vermont Tenant Hotline and email that you can reach out to, as well as our Vermont Tenants page on our CVOEO website, where you can find all of our renters workshops, but I will put those in the chat. And below is the fair housing number with the extensions for myself and my supervisor, Jess, in case you want to schedule a consultation and discuss any potential acts of illegal housing discrimination. So I realized that we zoomed through these slides because we saved questions for the end. So now we have plenty of time to answer questions, and we can also end early if needed. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
I did have